So let's talk about horror movies for once. And actually, let's talk about vampire movies. I've already done two videos on this subject, and this one it's going to be a bit long. So if you have a problem with my dulcet, sexy Southern accent, then go watch Chris Stuckman do yet another Marvel or some other popcorn fare, but whatever. But anyway, I'm joking. I like Chris. I like his videos. He's pretty good. Um, so anyway, in the first one, I talked about the kind of the roots of it, right? Talking about the two strands, meaning you got Nosferatu, the ugly vampire, and then you have the more handsome, attractive vampire. That's the the Count Dracula. Then later on, the Christopher Lee Hammer horror. And most up until the 70s, that was kind of the framework, right? And it wasn't until the when Anne Rice put out Interview with the Vampire in '76, and it was a novel. It wasn't a movie, but it was a novel. Uh, Vampires begin to kind of change, where they stopped being um, either or. They became a little bit more flexible, and you begin to see it on like television shows and some movies and stuff like that, where vampires became more, like the person next door, right? And also in the 80s, and I talked about that, you had a couple of movies that came out that really began to kind of push the boundaries of what vampires are and what they're capable of. Now, of course, you had Fright Night, which is kind of a goof on the whole concept. It was kind of silly and kind of fun, and it took the old Dracula trope and kind of pushed it into a new direction. And then, of course, you had Near Dark, which kind of made it more of like an old west concept, and it's very action orientated, very uh, violent, but also it talked about a lot of things which a lot of other movies or concepts hadn't really addressed, which Anne Rice began to really address in her concepts is what does it really mean to be a vampire? And the ideas of like loneliness and immortality, and you don't really connect with people because you're not really one. If you are a vampire, you're and I think that's why it kind of got co-opted by goth culture and things of that nature, is because the idea of you're the outsider. A vampire is this attractive, handsome person, but he can't be with a human because he's not one. He preys on humans. He actually isn't a human. Or she's not one, right? Well, in the 80s, there was quite a few, like I said, some very notable vampire movies that came out, and of course in the 90s, the early 90s, there was a couple that came out, uh, like Bram Stoker's Dracula, which totally fleshed out the original idea. And this it was a little bit closer to what Bram Stoker had in mind when he did the novel way back in the 1800s. It was very uh, visual, almost to the point of being garish, almost like a Dario Argento movie. It's very colorful. The set pieces were very Victorian. You saw multiple versions of Dracula played awesomely by Gary Oldman. You saw an old Dracula, you saw a young Dracula, you saw him as a wolf, you saw him as a bat, you saw him as a sexual creature. I mean, you saw him as like all these different things, which is what Dracula was. I mean, Dracula could do all those things in the novel, right? They never could quite do it in film up until special effects came along, and then you had a filmmaker which had the vision and the money to do it, which was, of course, Francis Ford Coppola, the man behind The Godfather and several other classic movies. Well, a couple of years later, uh, Neil Jordan, who, and I did a video, a little discussion about him. Neil Jordan, who's not really known as a horror director, not specifically, he actually took a crack at it, and he got a chance to do Interview with the Vampire. Now he was hot off the success of The Crying Game. When he was young, back in the early '80s, when he was a young director, kind of coming out of British cinema, he did a movie called The Company of Wolves, which was kind of a revisionist take on the werewolf story. And I'm definitely going to do a video about that one, about discussing about, because I love that movie. I think it's great. It's very unique. And but for the most part, he was known for like more like dramas, and occasionally he did like political thrillers and stuff like that. He was more of like a director. He did a lot of stuff. He wasn't really tied down to one genre or another. Well, anyway, when he did Interview with the Vampire, he got a really big budget because The Crying Game was such a success. They gave him kind of carte blanche as to what to do, and he took it into this direction where it, he kind of portrayed the vampires as like these rock stars. and they're real mopey and whiny, and they're very like depressing people, right? And again, that's why I think a lot of youth, and especially a lot of people within the goth culture, the old Batcavers and the and that ilk, really kind of latched on to that concept because it was speaking to them. Again, it's speaking about being the outsider. About it talks about tragedy and loss, and the death of Claudia, and they're lonely people. They can't function as they can't have families. They can't function in normal society. They're so, and they're predators. They're at their core they're evil. They hunt humans. That's their, and of course Lestat. He's very comfortable with it, but Lewis never was that comfortable with it. And you see those kind of tropes in the book, and you see it kind of portrayed in the movie as well. And of course, Neil Jordan did a great job of conveying, the old America, New Orleans, and they got away from the Gothic setting and kind of set it more into the early American setting, which New Orleans was a very popular city, still is, but it was a very popular port city and stuff like that, and had a very unique flavor to it. And so anyway, vampire movies and horror movies in general kind of fell out of favor in the mid '90s, right? And the man who made American Werewolf in London, John Landis, actually did a vampire movie. It was okay. It wasn't great, but it was okay. And there's a couple of like kind of spoof ones that came out, but for the most part, after Interview with the Vampire, and then Bram Stoker's Dracula, which came out a lot earlier than that, that was kind of it for several years, right? And there's a couple of indie movies that came out, but for the most part, the whole concept just kind of died out, right? And well, it wasn't just vampire movies; it was horror movies in general, right? And of course, there's two words for that: Quentin Tarantino. Quote unquote indie movies kind of became the rage. Now, I cringe when I hear that expression because people call Pulp Fiction a quote unquote indie film. It's not an indie film. It's a fucking big budget Hollywood movie. I mean, come on. Now, Reservoir Dogs, yes, that was an indie film, but Pulp Fiction was not. I mean, it was a very much a big budget Hollywood film. I mean, Quentin Tarantino was just he kind of came out and he blew up like a rocket, And but people went back to like bank robbery movies and heist movies, and it was always, I think it was one of the famous film critics basically said it was like all you saw was all these famous actors sitting around a table talking to each other, smoking cigars with their hair slicked back. It's true. I mean, they're really. It wasn't. I mean, it was very naturalistic and a lot of conversations, and that was kind of what Quentin Tarantino was known for. And then a little bit later on, the quote unquote mumblecore, which is basically people sitting around a table and talking to each other, and a lot of random events kind of tied together, and kind of that John Cassavetes way that he kind of pioneered back in the '60s. And of course, Quentin Tarantino kind of picked up on it, and he started doing it. Right now, ironically, Quentin Tarantino did do a horror movie. He did. Um, from Dusk Till Dawn. And I remember actually, because I saw an interview with him, and he was like, "Oh, it's gonna be the best thing you ever saw. It's a bang in your head, drive-in horror movie, and you're gonna love it." And blah blah blah. And I went and saw it, and I thought it was a total piece of shit. I thought it was a parody. If anything. I mean, it was funny, but it was not a horror movie. It wasn't very scary. It was kind of dumb. It was kind of silly. But for the most part, like your serious uh, vampire movies kind of fell out of favor, right? And I guess because I think people think that, or people felt that Bram Stoker's Dracula and Interview with a Vampire, done by Neil Jordan, those were kind of the high water marks. It was like you can't quite get past that. I mean, and it took a while for things to kind of fall back into place. Now, in the early '90s, a film came out, which at the time was kind of panned by critics and fans didn't really like it. And a lot of people thought it was stupid. And however, it got picked up as a television show 5 years later, right? So it came out, I believe, in '92 and '97. It got picked up as a television show for a new network called the WB. And of course, any of you guys that are fans of the show know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Buffy, right? Now, the original one, I can't for the life of me recall who actually did it, but it had like Christy Swanson, it had Donald Sutherland, it had Paul Rubens in a non Pee Wee Herman role, and it had Hilary Swank. And this is before she became the Oscar it girl of the 2000s, right? This was before she did like Boys Don't Cry and Million Dollar Baby and all that stuff, right? She was kind of a young unknown actor, and the movie I actually saw it and I really wasn't very impressed with it. I mean, it was okay, but it was kind of too teeny bopper, and it was trying too hard to appeal to a youth audience. I just didn't really get it. Now, the television show, I was really young. I was in my early 20s when it came out. I think I was 22 or 23 when it came out. And this was before, a lot of you young folk out there. I'm not trying to demean you, but I mean, this you got to keep in mind. This was before things like streaming services and things of that nature. So basically, you couldn't really, you had to either rent something, go to like a physical video store and rent it, or you had to watch it on television, right? And the first couple of episodes, I really didn't care for it. I thought it was a little too hip, a little too trendy, but it kind of grew on me as I watched more and more of it. It kind of grew on me, and I kind of identified with the characters. And I think a lot of the success of that television show comes from two places. One is Joss Whedon never really took the subject matter very seriously. There was always kind of a tongue in cheek, wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of feel about it, and it was very comic booky, right? And the other thing is, is Sarah Michelle Gellar was so charming in that role. I thought she did really good. I mean, she has that kind of girl next door, charm about her, and she's very attractive, and she also is seems like she's a very likable person. And I've heard people actually met her in real life, and they say that she's in real life she's actually a very likable person. But anyway, the television show was kind of it wasn't really a parody, but it kind of created its own little like comic book style universe, which at the time was kind of unique. It was kind of a unique spin on the whole concept because and for a television show, I mean it's kind of dated nowadays, but at the time the budget was pretty good, and some of the effects, the practical effects and stuff were not bad. I mean some of the prosthetics and stuff like that, and some of the stunts. I used to one of the things that used to crack me up was Buffy'd be in her high heel boots and her bell bottoms, she'd be out there kicking some demon's ass, like pulling all these kung fu moves and stuff like that. I always thought that was so hilarious watching it. I mean, it always got kind of I got a little bang out of it. But anyway, so it took the vampire mythos and it kind of draws more of an influence from something like Fright Night, where it took it and kind of was a goof on it. It was kind of silly, but it also had some serious moments, and there was some great television that kind of came out of that, like the episode where Buffy's mom died, and a couple of other key sequences, which really kind of pioneered the whole concept. And well, anyway, after Buffy, there was a movie that came out that is not technically a vampire movie, but I think I need to mention it because it kind of had that aesthetic to it that Near Dark did, and it was very visually striking. Had a lot of gothic imagery and stuff like that. Of course, the movie I'm talking about is The Crow with Brandon Lee. Now, The Crow is actually kind of a postmodern version of something like High Plains Drifter. It's basically a revenge tale, right? But the central character, Brandon Lee's character, is he's a spirit of vengeance, right? And within the show or within the movie, like I said, the bad guy's really bad, and then the henchmen are really bad. I mean, it has like all the comic book tropes in it, and they're all loyal to each other, and it's got these like high octane gun battles and stuff like that. It kind of to me is kind of a gap between this movie that come out in the late '90s that would further revolutionize the vampire uh, tropes and give it a lot more depth. Excuse me. So anyway, you had those two, and also there was there's a movie called Nadia, who's done by a director who did the same director who did King of New York, Abel Ferrar. And Nadia actually wasn't bad, but it was a little bit more of the psychological bent. It had more of kind of like a kind of like Rosemary's Baby or something like that. It had that kind of feel to it, the Roman Polanski style psychological horror. And there's a couple of other indie vampire movies that came out that weren't they're pretty decent, but for the most part, the more popular stuff began to kind of develop this more action kind of scenario to it. And then now they attempted, I believe it was Fox attempted to do a kind of a teeny bopper themed vampire story which was based off the video game called Vampire the Masquerade, and it did okay. I mean, it was, it really wasn't very good, but it did kind of add the soap opera element, which Joss Whedon would pick up in Buffy. Now he kind of goofed on it. He kind of made it a little more silly and kind of fun. And I think that's when the the concepts in the movies really became acceptable is because Joss Whedon was able to convey a sense of fun and comic bookiness, and it's cool. It was hip. I mean, Sarah Michelle Gellar was very attractive. The cast was very attractive. They all kind of had this charisma about them, right? And it got away from like the really serious, kind of almost laughable over drama or over dramatic statements, which you'd get like in an Interview with a Vampire or something like that, right? So anyway, after Buffy, the success of Buffy, about a year or two later, a New Line Cinema actually picked up a a very obscure Marvel comic. It was kind of a second or third tier character, and he was a black character, right, which was kind of rare in comic books at that time. He was a black superhero, but he was like half vampire, blah blah blah. And they actually signed on Wesley Snipes. Now Wesley Snipes was at that time kind of known for doing like serious dramas, or he occasionally did action movies. He did like Demolition Man, and he did Passenger 57, but he also did like Sugar Hill. He was in King of New York. He was in New Jack City. He was in I'm trying to think. There's a Mo Better Blues. I mean, he was in a bunch of movies, and he was kind of an up and coming African American actor. And he was one of the first, as Dave Chappelle kind of pointed out when he was kind of doing his parody on Print, or not Prince, but Rick James in his television show. He was one of the first like black actors, right? I mean, he wasn't light skinned; he was black, right? But it added to me as an element of realism, and he's really good. I mean, I think he's a pretty good actor. He just unfortunately he's fallen into a lot of trouble, and he's gotten problems with the IRS and stuff like that. But anyway, he did a movie called Blade, and Blade was actually a pretty successful movie. Now, Blade kind of comes out of the Crow and more of the near dark strand of vampire movies, where it's an action packed, high octane, a lot of fight scenes, a lot of special effects, a lot of, but it also has the gothic imagery and the and that kind of feel. I mean, you're watching a vampire movie when you're watching it, and even though it's set in the modern day, there's a lot of gothic tropes to it, and I thought it was really good. I mean, now I've watched it recently, and it hadn't really held up very well. The special effects are kind of hokey and kind of clunky looking or whatever, but as a whole, I think the movie is still pretty good. Now, it's not quite what Bram Stoker's Dracula or Interview with the Vampire was. I still think those are kind of high watermarks as far as that goes, but it was pretty good. So, in the 2000s, the Underworld series came out. I believe it came out in 2003. And those mixed the werewolf and the vampire mythos together, and again, did a very high octane, kind of fun, over the top version of the mythos, and it got away from the more serious, kind of, dare I say, gothic elements, and kind of put it into a modern. And it had like its own little story, which I thought was pretty fascinating. It had its own little storyline to kind of pull into it. And Kate Blanchett, or not Kate Blanchett, but I can't think of what her name is, but the actor that does the central character, she does a really good job. And again, she's very attractive, and she's got this charisma about her. To me, she's almost like she was custom fit. Now, of course, in real life, she's like this very serious British actor that has done some pretty interesting roles. But I mean, seeing her in that movie, it's almost like she was. Yeah, I couldn't imagine anybody else doing that part, as a central character in that movie. And it kind of expands. It gives like a lot more science, and gave it more of kind of like a steampunk feel. There's like a lot of stuff that was kind of talked about in like role playing games and novels, but wasn't really talked about in the movies. And Blade and the Underworld series kind of expanded on those concepts, right? And so anyway, yeah, vampires kind of became pop culture. They became cool. And now I'm going to back up a little bit and start talking about the indie. There's quite a few indie films that came out, going all the way back to the '80s, that I think really had a impact on the genre as a whole, which I'm going to kind of delve into here. If you're more into that kind of style of filmmaking, and this is before I get it. Um, and I'm going to kind of try to move it up into the modern era, right? And of course, I mentioned The Hunger in the last video. That was certainly one, but you also had movies, a lot of revisionist type stuff coming out. He had Shadows of the Vampire, which was kind of a romp on the Nosferatu style, and had like a very charming Willem Dafoe was in it. He plays Count Orlok, and he plays it where like Orlok's actually a real entity. You had that. You had in the late '70s, 1979, Werner Herzog, the great German film director, who worked with Klaus Kinski on several movies. He did a movie called Nosferatu. He did a remake of Nosferatu, and he actually did two versions of it. He did a German and an English version. I actually saw both of them, and they're both really good. They're almost spot on. And he kind of brought that style of the ugly vampire. He kind of brought it back into the fold, and then in the '90s, going back to the early '90s, um, Guillermo del Toro did. He'd actually done a couple of vampire movies, which I'll get into, but he did a movie called Kronos, which was kind of a revisionist vampire story, and it was really good. I mean, it was very unique, and it kind of hinted around to his genius a lot later on. When he started doing like Pan's Labyrinth, The Devil's Backbone, all these movies that are generally regarded as the best. He did a really good indie vampire movie. That was, I believe, it was Mexican or Latin American of some sort. I remember I actually saw it in the movies. I didn't know what the hell it was, and I started watching it, and I was like, "Wow, this is actually pretty. This is pretty good. It's got it going on." Now he did a sequel to Blade. He did Blade 2, and Blade 2 has a lot of the what I call Guillermo del Toroisms in it. Like a lot of his little tropes are kind of sprinkled about in that movie if you watch it really close, and it's a lot of fun. And then there's a movie called The Addiction, which came out in the mid '90s, and it was a more of a drama, and that's the one that Abel Ferrara did. And it's I mean it's very visual, it's very kind of psychological, and it also kind of brought back the whole idea of uh, the vampire as kind of like an actual person. It got away from the silliness and the goofiness and brought it back to being the vampire as an actual person. Now, Nadja also kind of deals with that. Nadja, who was the director, was Michael Almeretta. No, I don't know who that is, but it was kind of a David Lynch was actually in it, and it was kind of an interesting, more of a serious take on the vampire story. And I'm trying to think of some other ones here. But yeah, I mean, vampire movies kind of got into the lexicon, and they became a very common character, or very common, like in Van Helsing, and there's a lot of different versions of it. That kind of walked the backs of like movies like Blade and the Underworld series and stuff like that. And all those movies were very popular for their time. And all the way through the 2000s, I mean, there was quite a few big budget, you know, vampire movies that kind of came out. Now, in 2007, 30 Days of Night came out, which is a really good kind of return to form in the classic traditional vampires, are these hideous beasts kind of creatures. They had like this weird language, and they were very like Eastern European. And they're kind of laying siege to this town up in Alaska. And I thought that the story was great. And then more recently, you had like things like Stakeland, which is pretty good. And now you've had some crap movies like Vampires and Dracula 2000. I mean, those are some pretty bad ones. But for the most part, you've had quite a few good ones. And now, recently, in the last 10 years or so, you've had some really good ones. And I think probably the best is a Swedish movie that came out. I think it's Swedish. It's either Swedish or hang on. Let me look. Let me jump up on Wikipedia here really quick. It's from Tomas Alfredson, who did a really. He's one of my favorite directors right now. He did a great Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and it's a Swedish movie, but it talks about it takes it into a more unusual direction where it takes it away from the adults, right, or kind of the adult themes, and puts it more in kind of a child's theme. And the central character is a child vampire, right? And I thought it was very, because in other, like in Anne Rice's stories, it's like you don't want to turn to children because they become very violent because they can't grow. And it kind of touched on that in Near Dark. The kid vampire was getting very frustrated with being a vampire, but Let the Right One In actually has one of the central characters is a vampire, a child vampire, and she is very she's lethal. I mean, she's very deadly, and it's a very interesting take on the whole concept. And it's very dark and very moody, and it's kind of it's like very of course it's filmed up in filmed up in Sweden, so it's a lot of snow and and things of that. I mean, it's a very kind of downer kind of movie. And but anyway, the uh, the concept as a whole kind of got away from the big budget Hollywood version of it, and kind of went back into the more into the kind of indie uh, realm, right? And most recently, you've had things like What We Do in the Shadows, which is from the guy that made Thor, and it's a comedy. It's funny. I mean, it's hilarious. It's got a lot of dry humor. It's got that kind of New Zealand style humor. And then you've had let me see here. I Am Legends, kind of a post-apocalyptic take, and it's kind of I mean, it's kind of a roundabout sort of vampire story. And then, like I said, Let Me In or Let the Right One In. That one is really good. The remake was okay, but I think the original was a lot better. And so yeah, to kind of sum it up, I mean, the vampire. A lot of writers and directors have kind of taken. Oh, Byzantium. That's what I was going to talk about. Byzantium. Byzantium is another one that uh, that Neil Jordan did. That was a lot more. It was a lot different than. It was a lot different than Interview, whereas Interview was this big budget, you know, Hollywood extravaganza. Byzantium is a lot smaller. It's a lot more kind of low budget. It's a lot more kind of an indie film. And it's really good. It's got a Saoirse Ronan in it, and she's really good. I mean, like I said, I think she's one of the better one of the better actors we've had. I said this in a previous video. And and then We Are the Night is a really good one. I believe it's a German production. It's really good. I mean, it revolves around women instead of men, which I thought was kind of an interesting take on it. And yeah, so I mean, there's if you're really into the vampire genre, there's a ton of movies you can watch. But I would definitely recommend if you're more into like the indie side of it, I'd like do like Naja and Let Me In or Let the Right One In, which is the and then We Are the Night and The Affliction. Those are really good. And if you're more to like kind of the bigger budget, and Byzantium's another indie one I think is really good. And 30 Days a Night is definitely good. If you're more into the big budget ones, I would definitely recommend something like some of the Underworld movies. Some of the earlier ones are okay. They kind of got ridiculous toward the end, but they're pretty good for what they are. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of come of age now. The problem with the vampire story is, and I gotta talk about this because unfortunately it's somebody's gonna say something. I kind of forgot to mention this tidbit, a little fact, but unfortunately the vampire movie or the vampire genre is kind of in flux, and the reason why is because Twilight kind of it kind of changed the aesthetic, and it went from like really serious, kind of adult themed, very cerebral type stuff into and even kind of silly Buffy, kind of light comic book fare. It kind of took it from that and made it into like I was a teenage vampire, and the whole concept is creepy. I mean, you got this handsome vampire that's basically stalking a high school. To me, that's just so the whole concept is so weird, right? But yeah, if like I said, if you're really into vampire movies, I mean, I would start with the biggies. Right, so definitely to sum all this up, I would definitely start with like Nosferatu, And if you're very uncomfortable with the original silent movie, watch the Werner Herzog because it's almost it's almost a direct remake. And watch the English version with Klaus Kinski. Now there's a German version one that's pretty good too, but it's got a lot of subtitles and stuff like that. Watch Universal's Dracula with Bela Lugosi, and then watch a couple of the early ones that Hammer did with Christopher Lee. And then of course when you get into like the '80s, you got Near Dark, you've got The Hunger, you've got Near Dark, The Hunger, Fright Night, and then also you have in the '90s you have the arguably the two most well envisioned, the biggest budgets. That'd be, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola, and then of course you got Interview with the Vampire, which Neil Jordan did in '90. Now they're talking about doing a Interview with the Vampire television show, and they're going to correct a lot of the wrongs that was in the movie. For example, the character of Armand, played by the I can't think of his name, is the Spanish actor. He was older, right, in the movie, whereas in the book he's young. He's like a teenager, right? And there's a couple little things. There's a couple little they had to change for the movie, and they're going to flesh it out because they had to cut a bunch of stuff out to get it to fit in the film and whatever. But anyway, it's still despite all that, it's still a really good movie, and I think it's a really serious send up. And if you're really kind of in more of the silly, kind of goofy one, watch some of the old Buffy episodes. I mean, those are pretty good. I mean, they're for what they are, they're pretty good. And also, What We Do in the Shadows is really good. And if you're more like the action one, definitely Blade. The first two Blade movies are still really good. They're kind of the special effects are kind of clunky and they're kind of hokey. And also the We Are the Night We Are the Night is pretty good. And or We Come at Night or whatever, the German movie that came out a couple years ago. It's pretty good. And then Byzantium is really good with Saoirse Ronan. It's kind of an interesting indie kind of take on it. And so anyway, but yeah, hopefully I can. Hopefully people find this discussion informative, and I really enjoyed doing this video. And I'll probably do another some other ones here. But anyway, if you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave a comment or whatever. And I shall talk to you guys later.